Hello and welcome to another episode of For Zion's Sake, the CUFI UK podcast. My name is Alex and I'm joined here by Alastair.
Hello.
And this week we're going to be talking about the Hamas leader and how his death has brought out anti-Semites and terror supporters from the woodwork.
That's right. Plus, we discuss why Israel was right to outlaw UNRWA. Plus, with the revelations that there is a deep connection between Al-Jazeera and Hamas, we explain why, in our opinion, Al-Jazeera should be taken off the air in Britain with immediate effect.
That's right. We also want to know your views on these subjects, so please let us know in the comments down below.
So, Alex, we're back after a short break from podcasting.
Yep.
And since we've been away, I mean, such a lot has happened. We're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything, but we are going to cover a few very important things that we want to highlight and to discuss.
Yep.
Firstly, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, the former leader of Hamas, because he is in fact now dead.
Yep.
He was killed by the IDF. He came out of his rabbit warren to the surface and was killed by the IDF, and he was the orchestrator of October the 7th massacre. Because he was not a freedom fighter, he was not a liberator, he was not a peace negotiator, he was not an anti-colonialist, he was none of those things. He was a terrorist.
Yep.
And his killing was a very significant development in the Israel-Hamas conflict.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was the single head of Hamas because obviously Yahya Sinwar was taken out in Tehran a few months ago or a few weeks ago. And so Yahya Sinwar held all the keys to Hamas's decision-making. So therefore it does sort of open up questions as to what will happen with hostage negotiations and things, because he was the single person making those decisions. So I'm not sure now what the Hamas organizational sort of developments have happened in terms of who's the leader and so forth.
And also preventing progress in those negotiations.
Yeah.
I mean, the media was saying, sort of pitching in some cases, oh no, now what will happen with the negotiators now that this barbarian is dead?
Yeah.
They didn't quite say it like that.
No.
But actually there's been a lot of thought that actually there might well be some opportunity that Israel has.
Yeah.
But we know that this was a mass murderer.
Yeah.
And he was prepared to, he was prepared to see the killing not just of Jews, but of Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah.
For the sake of his barbaric cause and the cause of Hamas and the jihadist ideology of wiping out Israel from the face of the earth.
Exactly. Yeah, he was a bad guy, and like you said, the media didn't necessarily depict him as the evil that he was. I mean, there are video clips of him, saying outrageous things about, the blood of the children needs to be sacrificed in order to take out the Zionist regime. He spoke when he was stood near the fence in Gaza saying, we will tear down this fence and, we'll break through this fence, tear out the hearts from their bodies, that sort of thing. He said horrific things. He incited this violence. He orchestrated, as you said, the October 7th attack. So he was actually, even though he's being painted as this hero who fought the IDF, I mean, for example, he was filmed sat in a chair. He threw a stick at the UAV. He had been shot in the arm, but there were reports of him losing a hand and him fighting to the death and this sort of thing. In reality, he had been shot in the arm. He hadn't lost a hand. When the IDF killed him, they didn't even know it was Sinwar. And we should point out there that wasn't a mistake by the IDF. The IDF purposely did their strategy to surround Rafah in order to actually force him out. They just didn't know at the time that they had got him until they obviously ID'd the body.
Yeah.
But going back to sort of the way he died, it is being depicted as a heroic event by the Palestinians. He is being immortalized because of it. But in reality, he was doing everything he could to preserve his life and using Palestinians as human shields to preserve his life.
But on the afternoon of the day that it was speculated at the time that Israel had killed the leader of Hamas, I was watching Sky News, and they had a number of so-called, quote, experts that were clearly Hamas sympathizers, and they were just allowed. I mean, there was one particular interviewee that had 20 minutes of airtime with just him and the presenter. And the presenter, I think, was probably, I don't know what he was doing, reading his emails at the time or something, because literally he was given free rein to come out with all sorts of nonsense. And one of the quotes which I have from this commentator on Sky News was, "For the Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims and many people in the world, he's an anti-colonial leader who was trying to free his people from Israeli subjugation."
Yeah.
And I think that what the death of Yahya Sinwar has done, as first of all, it has provided Hamas sympathizers with a, quote, martyr.
Yeah.
And that is not Israel's fault.
No.
At all.
Yeah.
But it has, as a consequence,
done
that. But also it has brought Hamas sympathizers out of the woodwork in a big, big way. Because once upon a time, you could take to the streets of a pro-Palestinian march, shouting from the river to the sea, blah, 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 blah. And we know that that is anti-Semitic, and we know that that is a genocidal quote.
Yeah.
But you could just about get away with not demonstrating an overt support for Hamas, and yet still be pro-Palestinian in your sort of motive and agenda. But when this happened, you suddenly started getting vocal support on the streets for Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah.
Which was basically, I think, just letting the cat out of the bag.
Yeah.
And demonstrating and exposing the very deep, volatile support for a terrorist organization, and an organization, by the way, which is outlawed in the United Kingdom.
Yeah. Exactly.
Every single person that was on the street that was showing sympathy to Yahya Sinwar's death or celebrating him as a so-called martyr was supporting terrorism.
Yeah.
And it is volatile, and it is more widespread than I think we could have ever have imagined.
Yeah.
If you go on the thread of most of the UK news media channels on their social media, you will see lots and lots of support for Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah.
And I think we have gone now to a point we've never been at before. And actually, this killing of Sinwar has exposed that.
Yeah.
And that is not a nice thing to be able to sit here and witness, but is probably the necessary thing.
Yeah.
That darkness will be exposed. And it's,
Yeah, I agree completely. I think we have been obviously watching this happen for a long time. We've known the support for terror being there for decades, sort of thing. We've been saying it for a decade already through CUFI. But the thing is, we've often been told, oh, we are painting everybody as extremists, or we're painting the majority as extremists and things like that. And we shouldn't be saying they're supporting terror. They're just supporting innocent Palestinians and so on and so forth. Well, for many years when Hamas was not outlawed in this country, there were Hamas flags at pro-Palestinian rallies. For even longer, there were Hezbollah flags at pro-Palestinian protests in London for many years. There are still organizations who run, pro-Palestinian marches in the UK who are linked with Iran and linked with Hezbollah.
Yes.
And they have in the past openly supported not just the peaceful side of the march, but openly, in their own statements, supported terrorism through organizations like Hezbollah. So we've had them on our radar for many years, and I think the government, the police force, whoever, I think they're just sort of playing. It's kind of like the ostrich with the head in the sand sort of thing. They don't want to admit the reality that's in front of them. But we've been saying for, since October 7th, the spike of anti-Semitism in this country did not come because of Israel's response. It came because of Hamas's action.
Yes.
In fact, it was Hamas terrorism that spurred on anti-Semites in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're seeing it with this. It is an act of a terrorist who, died, in their eyes, a heroic death that has increased support for Hamas in this country in certain areas, with certain, people with certain ideologies and so forth within this country. And it is foolish for us as a nation to not recognize that problem, right?
Absolutely.
And the other thing I will say is, it was inevitable that Yahya Sinwar would have become a martyr, regardless of how he died. Even if he died in a tunnel, fearing for his life, he still would have been immortalized. And an example of this is in 2004, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was assassinated by Israel in Gaza City, and he was actually in a wheelchair, just being moved. I think he had done Friday morning prayers or something. He was just being wheeled along by someone, got taken out by an Israeli airstrike. And even he, someone who couldn't even fight, was immortalized, had murals of him, songs about him, all the rest of it. So Yahya Sinwar, being filmed actively fighting. I mean, he apparently had hand grenades on him and maybe some other weapons, and actually sort of threw them at the IDF and things like that. It's just going to big up his credentials really as a martyr. And I think it's just inevitable, really.
No, interesting what you said there. And also, I think his death should test the conscience of those who are pro-Palestinian in their position.
Well, the people who are really thinking they're doing it for the children in Gaza.
Yes.
Yeah, they should.
It really should test that.
But at the same time, when there was 100,000 people, marching years ago with Jeremy Corbyn and Stop the War Coalition and so forth at the front, they had Hezbollah flags.
Oh, I know.
They had
but what I'm saying it should test the conscience. Those who have been perhaps persuaded somewhat by the propaganda against Israel should be thinking, well, what side am I actually on? Because Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip to the suffering of the Palestinian people, diverting the aid, stealing the aid, subjugating the Palestinian people to as human shields. And really, it should wake them up.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think any rational person who's looking at this will see, terrorists. It's kind of like, imagine if, for example, Osama bin Laden, when he died, if there was like an increase of support for him, and on the streets there were British people, supporting Osama bin Laden, even though he had, done 9/11 and so forth. It's like, you just wouldn't imagine that. But when it comes to the Palestinians and when it comes to Israel, I just think, unfortunately, there are many people, whether it's a religious ideology or a political ideology or whatever the ideology is, they have got it in their brains that the Palestinians are innocent from top to bottom, and that every single terrorist is actually a freedom fighter. They're fighting evil in their minds, which is Israel and anything to do with Israel. And I think they are just brainwashed, hoodwinked, whatever it is. They're given over to reprobate minds, whatever the sort of thing is. They just cannot see it. Hopefully, the majority of people who are on the fence or in the middle politically can see it. But I think if you're already on a pro-Palestinian march, you're probably heading in the direction of being too far gone to actually understand it clearly. I don't know if I'm making sense there.
Yes.
But it just feels to me that, if they really were going to wake up, they would have woken up when there were Hezbollah flags. They would have woken up when when October the 7th happened and many, many innocent people died. And instead of them saying, we had people saying, oh, it wasn't Hamas, it was Israel that killed them. It wasn't, oh, they didn't target civilians. That's just a lie. They only targeted the military. All these things, they've already believed the lies. They've swallowed, they've drunk the Kool-Aid, as they say, and they are already too far gone, unfortunately. And they're not the people we're trying to influence. We're trying to influence Christians. We're trying to influence people who are of sound mind in the middle, trying to work these things out. And hopefully they can see the good of Israel versus the evil of Hamas. And hopefully, as open support for Hamas happens, they will be the ones, like you're saying, who will take note and go, hang on, maybe I shouldn't.
So
be
I think it
them.
has brought a lot of support out the woodwork for Hamas.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we know that this is a battle between light and darkness, and the tactics which the anti-Israel movement uses, such as terminology like freedom fighting and colonialism, which really does tap into particularly a Western far left mindset, which is being courted by the pro-Hamas movement in order to try and manipulate that support as well. So there's lots of things happening, and it's quite interesting.
No, it's actually interesting what you said there about the sort of the left wing, it taps into that sort of terminology. And I think a lot of the terminology they use actually taps into things which is, whether it's anti-colonialism, anti-Western, and, whatever it is that they are about.
Apartheid.
Apartheid and things like that. But literally, yes, exactly, anti-apartheid and things. And ultimately, we're all against apartheid, right? We're all against genocide. We're all against... But they're tapping into it in a politicized way. But ultimately, they're lying because Israel is not a colonialist settler.
No.
This is their homeland. Actually, the Palestinians are the colonialists. Israel is not committing genocide. Israel is fighting a just war to defend its people.
Yes.
And actually, on October the 7th, the Palestinians, or Hamas, committed a genocide against Jews, or an attempted genocide.
Yeah.
It's the same with all these different terminologies. The apartheid, actually, we're talking about, in Israel, the only place in the Middle East, Israel is the only place in the Middle East where you have religious freedom. Christians are growing. The LGBT community is allowed to actually exist in Israel, whereas it's not allowed to exist anywhere else, and especially not under Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And so you have all these sort of different lies that are being spread. And actually, Israel is the most sort of open and vibrant community in the Middle East that you would think the left would actually support them. But instead, the left is hand in hand with the, extremist, Islamist fundamentalists who are against everything that they're proclaiming.
Yeah.
And it's this like unholy union that's taken place between these two groups.
Yeah.
And yet on the streets, they are the best of friends, in the UK. And yet, if those same protesters, were walking down the streets of Gaza, they probably wouldn't last very long.
No.
And actually, we've unfortunately seen that happen when, peace activists, use an Israeli car and accidentally drive down the wrong road into a West Bank or, Judea Samaria, Palestinian town, and suddenly they're surrounded by Palestinians trying to lynch them because they think they're Israeli and things.
Yeah.
We see that happening. There's a peace activist from one European country who went to Gaza to support them, ended up being kidnapped by Hamas and murdered. It's like there are so many examples where if they were really in Gaza, it would be problematic for them. But in the streets of London, they're best of friends.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the next topic, there was just one other thing I just wanted to highlight. Things that do not make sense, Alex.
Yeah.
We heard from President Biden and other world leaders that were commending Israel on the killing of Yahya Sinwar and basically saying good riddance.
Yeah.
And yet, when you think about it, this happened in Rafah, the very place that President Biden and the same world leaders were telling Israel they must not enter Rafah at any cost.
Yeah.
And here we have not only Yahya Sinwar, but other top Hamas leaders have over the last few months since Israel entered have been removed. And importantly, Hamas's overall strategy of fighting Israel has been hindered significantly because of Israel cutting off, that operational side.
Yeah, exactly.
So there are huge contradictions when you hear, world leaders come out and say, "Oh, well done, Israel." It would not have happened had Israel not been quite headstrong in telling the world leaders that, well, we're going to do what we think we should do.
Yeah, exactly. And good on them, because, you couldn't imagine if America was doing something to protect its citizens and to deal with a threat to its people, and it listening to the world telling it to stop, right? And I think that's the thing. Like, even though the whole world is against Israel, Israel just has to do what it thinks is best because it is a sovereign state, and it's doing the best for its people. Yeah. So, good on them for it.
And there are things which world leaders would regard as contentious that Israel is doing, and that time and time again is proving to be a good move.
Yeah.
And of course, we must recognize that Israel is on the offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yep.
But Israel is not the aggressor. They are, of course, responding to months and months of Hezbollah rocket attacks.
Yeah.
And intent, actually, for Hezbollah to replicate what Hamas did in southern Israel, Hezbollah had planned to do in northern Israel.
Yep.
And we have seen with Israel's striking of Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, we are seeing Hezbollah being severely hampered.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we hear criticism towards Israel for, striking various places which were formerly civilian places and are now filled with quivering terrorists with rocket launchers. And yet, we need to get behind Israel. We need to support Israel and trust that they are making these decisions with a moral clarity and moral intent.
Yeah.
And another criticism is that of the banning of UNRWA within Israel.
Yeah.
Right now, this week, Israel has banned UNRWA, the UN arm which deals with the Palestinian refugees.
Yeah.
And it has come under great scrutiny. But it shouldn't surprise us, I don't think,
not at all,
that Israel is taking this position, having warned the UN, warned the world, that UNRWA or members of UNRWA have been complicit with Hamas for some time.
Exactly. And I think the connection between Hamas and UNRWA, even though obviously UNRWA is not Hamas, they're not a terrorist organization,
No.
there are unfortunately links between the two, which make it
It's unviable, really, for UNRWA to be able to operate without Israel feeling that there is a significant risk to its security.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, Israel is advocating for the reformation of UNRWA, and has made various proposals for what can change so that 10% of UNRWA staff members are not members of Hamas.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
Israel's also produced evidence that 12 were specifically involved individually involved in the Hamas massacre of October the 7th.
Yeah, I mean, there was literally UNRWA staff who kidnapped Israeli bodies, right,
Yes.
and took them into Gaza to hold them for ransom for Hamas. The same thing happened with UNRWA-run hospitals. When Israel went into, obviously into Gaza, they took over certain hospitals. They took the CCTV footage from those hospitals, and they found that UNRWA-run hospitals were used as bases for Hamas. There's video of hostages being taken into those hospitals and taken underneath them and being held there, where UNRWA staff would have seen this happening.
Yes.
And, you know, UNRWA is meant to be a neutral. The United Nations is meant to be neutral in all of this.
Yes.
If they see terrorism and they don't act upon it, and, you know, staff are obviously seeing this happen. And by the way, I'm not saying that UNRWA staff should be there fighting Hamas or anything like that, but they could have at least reported it up the chain to UNHQ and said, we know there's hostages in this UNRWA hospital.
Actually, UNRWA probably has a better duty of care for its own staff members that are in a war zone. And so actually, UNRWA should be alarmed that there are terror tunnels under its own premises.
Yeah, exactly.
Any organization would be would take due diligence at making sure that there was no connection or any way in which terrorist groups might be aided. In any way whatsoever.
Well, you would think so, but unfortunately, the UN did its own investigations into UNRWA and found no connection.
No.
And then Israel goes in, takes over the hospitals and things, and finds, you know, very significant connections, which we've been talking about for years. There's other organizations like UN Watch who have done fantastic work in exposing UNRWA. In my mind, there is absolutely a connection between UNRWA and Hamas. And I think it goes back to, like, there was several years ago when there was a former head, I don't know his name exactly, but there was a former head of UNRWA who was inside of Gaza, who was being interviewed by the BBC.
Right.
And the BBC said something along the lines of, you know, the interviewer asked him about the strikes on Israel. Are they concerned about them? And he responded and said, no, we're not concerned because Israel's very precise and they're only taking out terror infrastructure. Well, that UNRWA leader, you know, he was employed by the UN, a neutral person supposedly, and I think he was by the way he responded. Right. He was kicked out of Gaza by Hamas. They stopped the UN UNRWA head being there anymore because he had said nice things about Israel. Basically, he countered the genocide sort of plea. He was then replaced by a British guy who was basically a propagandist for Hamas. And so he, a few years back, I don't know if you remember, he was the one who was there being interviewed by the BBC and started crying on TV over the number of deaths and things like that. And this was obviously back when Israel was being extremely precise. It didn't have boots on the ground even in Gaza. Yes. But he was clearly using his emotion, and it was emotional manipulation, basically. But anyway, the guy who was there crying about how horrible Israel is and saying there's no connection between Hamas and UNRWA and so forth, he was inside a building, UN headquarters, that directly underneath it was a Hamas base, and the Hamas base and the UN UNRWA headquarters were sharing the same power supply, meaning that UNRWA was providing electricity for Hamas.
Wow.
And you wouldn't be able to do that. There wouldn't be a way that a UN-controlled building... And by the way, this is just one example. There's UN schools that had tunnels found under them. There's UN hospitals which had terror bases inside of them, weapons and so forth. Like you said.
Yes.
I can literally go on for a long time about all the lists.
We know for a long time that there's been curriculum provided in UNRWA schools for Palestinians which are for propaganda against Israel.
Yeah. And they are brainwashing the next generation.
And for anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So it is problematic. And I think we've also discussed, and I think it's worth mentioning again, that the Palestinian territories are the only part of the world that has its own UN organization dealing with refugees.
Yeah.
There is another UN body that deals with the entire world's refugee situations.
Yeah, the
and that is
UNHCR.
UNHCR.
CR even,
And they work in 130 countries and have 11,000 staff. UNRWA, which deals only in the Palestinian territories, has 30,000 members of staff.
Yeah, so almost 3 times more.
Almost 3 times as many staff members in that one part of the world dealing with Palestinian refugees compared with the 130 countries. And let's be honest, there are many, many refugee crises in the world that do not get anywhere near the same proportionate finance either. There's disproportion in terms of the finance which goes to UNRWA, and also since 1949, when UNRWA was established, it has not resettled a single Palestinian refugee. Ever.
It's crazy.
Zero, zilch, nada. Whereas the UNHCR, since 1950, has resettled more than 50 million refugees.
I
think it's about time that's looked into.
Yeah, exactly. It is absolutely shocking. I mean, talk about, we often have it from the anti-Israel groups. They sort of mock us for supporting the, quote, chosen people, which we obviously do believe is true. But I would say actually in the world's eyes, the chosen people are the Palestinians, because how is it that a tiny group of people who are, bearing in mind, most Palestinians are not refugees. If you are a Palestinian and you're living in Gaza, or, well, I'll say now, there are refugees in Gaza, obviously, people who have moved
because of the displacement.
Because of the displacement,
yes,
due to the
that's
war.
Correct.
Just as there is in Lebanon, just as there is in Israel, right? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, if you let's say you live in the West Bank, you have a house, you're a citizen of the Palestinian territories, you are under the Palestinian government, you're no longer a refugee.
But UNRWA say you are.
Exactly. But the same thing is, if you are, for example, Gigi Hadid or one of these big celebrities who's a multi-millionaire, whose dad, is, I think, maybe even a billionaire, you're still classed as a refugee.
Yeah. And also, if your great-grandparents were refugees proper, right, and you now have a home in wherever, and not just actually in the Palestinian territories, anywhere in the surrounding countries or anywhere in the world, you still have the status of a Palestinian refugee.
Exactly.
So you could literally move to Britain, live in Britain, have citizenship in Britain, and yet still be considered a Palestinian refugee because your grandparent was.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is as well, even with that, there's a lot of grey area around who was and wasn't a refugee, even at the time. Like there were people that like, for example, there's a lot of evidence that even from like the British Empire, when we were in control of the Mandate for Palestine, they were saying that there was an influx of Arab and Muslim immigration into the Mandate for Palestine, which was a counter to the Jewish immigration into the land. Obviously, the Jews wanted to return to their homeland. The Arabs that were going to Israel were actually just trying to stop the Jews returning to their homeland. When Israel was established as a nation, and when the Arab world literally said to the people in Israel and the Palestinian territories to leave, we're going to wipe the Jews out and then you can return later, that they were telling basically foreigners in the land to leave temporarily and then come back once we've taken out the Jews. The narrative that's being sold is that the Palestinians had lived there for generations, that, going back, centuries, it's like everything they're saying, Jesus was a Palestinian. They're literally trying to rewrite history to try and insert themselves into it, right? And yet the world treats them in this special manner. Like you were saying, 50 million refugees have been rehomed by UNHCR, is it? In the last, 80 years or so. And yet not a single Palestinian has been rehomed. And it goes against all logic. You are not a refugee if you are living as a citizen in another country. It is against the rules of law. But unfortunately, none of the words that are used actually matter to the Palestinians because they're not refugees, they're not being genocided, they're not being colonized, all the rest of it. Go back to that. But one thing I just want to say with that, you raised an important point about the money. The UNHCR, its budget last year had around $100 per refugee. The UNRWA for the Palestinians had $250 per Palestinian refugee. So even on that side of things, they've got 3 times more staff, 2.5 times more money per refugee, and yet most of the people they're helping are not even refugees, and it is not a refugee center. It is a battering ram against Israel.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm
and they would lose that if, and what I do think should happen is that the need to help genuine present Palestinian refugees as a result of conflict need to be helped within a consolidation of the UNHCR.
Yeah,
because I think that would, in my opinion, would be fairer on all counts, and it would also, as I say, take away that battering ram which is used simply as a propaganda weapon against Israel and pointing the finger at Israel.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, you could look at it in a couple of ways. You could say, well, the UNHCR is being a lot more efficient with the money they're given, which obviously is a good thing. Or you could say the UNHCR is being underfunded because, compared to UNRWA. But the other thing, I just want to sort of hammer this home a bit more, because obviously I gave the example of the electricity, and also as well, you were talking before about Rafah, and you said how there was a lot of resistance to Israel going into Rafah, and one of the things was the Philadelphia corridor. Israel was saying, we have to take the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt. And the reason they had to take that was because they wanted to stop Hamas's ability to use its dozens of terror tunnels through there to keep bringing in weapons or to remove people or whatever was being happened there. And an effect of that, when Israel took over that area, the aid coming in from Egypt was then being either checked properly, or I think in some parts it stopped altogether. And there was a big concern that there would be a massive food shortage. Actually, what they found is that the prices in Gaza went down. Why? Because the UNRWA teams that were distributing the food through the Egypt border were no longer making a profit out of it. The Hamas terrorists who were controlling the distribution and flow of aid into Gaza were no longer making a profit out of it and weren't taking it. And actually, the Palestinians were releasing videos on social media going, look, we were thinking we were going to be starving because Israel was going to cut off the food. In fact, the price of this has gone down by 3 times. The price of this has gone, because actually it was then starting to be given freely to people. UNRWA aid is supposed to be freely given to Palestinians, but unfortunately, because Hamas gets in there and controls it, they start selling it to people rather than giving it freely because they make money for the terrorist organization. And that's why you have, Yahya Sinwar died a multi-millionaire, if not billionaire.
Yeah.
Ismail Haniyeh was a multiple billionaire.
Yes.
There's Palestinians alive today who are still multiple billionaires, because they exploited the people. Yes. And UNRWA is another way in which Hamas has been able to exploit the people, in which, to be honest, the world has been able to exploit the Palestinian people and use it against Israel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And also it undermines the efforts to help genuine refugees around the world, because our British government allocate, international aid to be passed on to the UN to help genuine refugees. Yeah. And that is completely being undermined if we're not holding the UN to account.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know that there's a lot of debate in terms of foreign aid, but come on, at least let's not make Hamas profit from it.
I know.
And that's what we've been doing. So We need to hold the UN to account. And actually, several months ago, the UK decided to stop funding UNRWA.
Yeah.
And a couple of days after the Labour Party came to power, they reinstated funding to UNRWA.
Yeah.
Which is actually in conflict with what Israel is trying to do by simply not hurting Palestinian refugees, but by basically trying to stop corruption, which is actually emboldening Hamas, which is at the moment, attacking Israel.
Yeah, I know, and that's the thing as well. Like, because the thing is, obviously, there were many countries actually that stopped funding to UNRWA because they saw the connection between UNRWA and Hamas.
Yes.
Well, that connection, it has been severed in some way because obviously a lot of Hamas fighters and terrorists have been taken out, and Israel has some control over the Gaza Strip. But there's still that ingrained connection between UNRWA and Hamas and the ideology there, which has not been dealt with. So actually, when these governments are putting money back into UNRWA now, it's basically like, oh, well, UNRWA's broken, but the Palestinians need help, so we'll just give it to the broken thing, rather than going through different channels to get aid to the people who need it.
Yes.
And I just want to point out, like, even though the UK has put money back into it, and I think it was done not because of, I think they sold it, probably even to themselves, they sold it to themselves as, oh, we need to help the Palestinians, let's refund UNRWA. Actually, I think it was just a political move, because I do think UNRWA is a battering ram against Israel. And like you said, Israel's outlawed UNRWA. Well, there are other countries who have also stopped funding UNRWA since the UK reinstated the funding. For example, Switzerland last month stopped its funding to UNRWA because it was shown the evidence, or it saw the evidence, that UNRWA is broken and needs replacing. And I think my personal view is I honestly think UNRWA needs to be disbanded, and replaced with a brand new thing, or integrated into the UNHCR, because it is not fit for purpose. And it is foolish that the UK government is sending tens of millions of pounds every year to UNRWA. The entire world is sending over £1 billion every year to UNRWA, maybe even £2 billion. I don't know exactly what the number is. It's so much money, and it is just sending it to this black hole of, propaganda against Israel, and it doesn't help the Palestinians, and it definitely doesn't help Israel.
Well, talking about propaganda against Israel and connections with Hamas and battle rams against the Jewish state, let's move on to Al Jazeera, because I think it goes without saying, but let's make it absolutely clear in case anyone is in any doubt, that Al Jazeera, the Qatari-owned news broadcaster, is a propaganda machine against Israel.
Yeah.
Including their social media arm, AJ+.
Yeah.
They are not just biased against Israel. I think we can use the word bias against Israel sometimes. It feels now to be quite a weak phrase, almost as if you can be biased in an almost indirect way. No. Al Jazeera is not simply biased. They are an outright propaganda machine to undermine the sovereignty and reputation of Israel.
Yeah.
And there was a report last week which I think goes beyond the speculation and concern that Al Jazeera might just be biased to actually having a direct link with Hamas.
Yeah.
And this is because the IDF came across they came across on the battlefield, essentially, documents which were belonging to 6 Al Jazeera journalists. Now, these were proper, current Al Jazeera journalists. They were active journalists. They were journalists who you see with their body protection in front of camera reporting from Gaza. And they discovered that 6 Al Jazeera Gaza-based journalists were members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad groups. And not just that, these were not just members on a piece of paper. These were active Hamas fighters.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was even exposed as in charge of Hamas rocket firing, which you would think was a full-time job. But the documents contained personal spreadsheets, lists of training courses, telephone books, salary documents, and unequivocally prove that the journalists were functioning members of terror groups. According to the IDF, the first document, which was issued by Hamas in 2020, provided Al Jazeera with, wait for this, instructions on how to cover up failed Islamic Jihad rocket launch. The document instructed Al Jazeera not to use the word, quote, massacre to describe the incident, to display minimal images, and to ensure Hamas was not criticized in panel discussions on the channel. A second document, also from 2022, instructed one journalist to support the, quote, resistance in his coverage of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the document specifically instructed Al Jazeera not to criticize PIJ's rocket capabilities or highlight its failed launches. And it goes on. So, yes, the documents reveal how Hamas directs Al Jazeera's media coverage to serve its own interests, preventing the public in Gaza and around the world from discovering the truth about its crimes against Gazan civilians, the IDF said in a statement. So these are 6 named Al Jazeera journalists, and we actually had reports earlier in the year of a number of Hamas fighters that had been killed that were reportedly linked with Al Jazeera, but this has further exposed a connection between Al Jazeera, which goes beyond the bias.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, this is a symptom of the bigger problem. Like, Al Jazeera is pro-Hamas. There is no question about it. How do we know this? Well, quite obviously, Qatar is Al Jazeera is the state broadcaster of Qatar. Everything that Al Jazeera says is funded and directed by Qatar. Well, what else is Qatar? Qatar is the largest funder of Hamas in the world, bigger than Iran. And actually, Haniyeh, when he was killed in Tehran, he had travelled from Qatar because the Hamas headquarters is based in Qatar. If we go back a few years, there was a big uproar against a building that was struck that housed Al Jazeera's main offices in Gaza. Well, it turned out one of the floors of that building was controlled by Hamas, and it was being used for their cyber operations against Israel. And you can guarantee, just as UNRWA and Hamas were sharing electricity, you probably find they were sharing the broadband or something between Al Jazeera and Hamas in that building. And actually, the owner of that building, when he phoned the IDF, and there's a recording of it from the Palestinian side where they're filming him recording, he's actually saying, yeah, we know Hamas is in there, but we've got other people who are in there who just want to grab a few laptops and things. Can they do it? And Israel said, no, you've got 2 minutes to leave. And then they evacuated. The whole media world condemned Israel because it was seen as an attack on journalism. Yes. Because Al Jazeera is in there. But like you said, these 6 journalists, this is much bigger than these 6 journalists. This is Al Jazeera being a propaganda arm for Hamas.
Yes. Because these journalists, they weren't just some like part-time freelancers.
Yeah.
Okay, they were like correspondents.
Yeah. Key
on the
Al
news
Jazeera
channels.
people, yeah. Key Al Jazeera people and key in Hamas as well. I mean, one of them he wasn't there firing rockets. He was directing others to fire rockets.
Yes.
So he was key in Hamas and he was key in Al Jazeera.
Yes.
What does that say? If you're high up in both organizations, there's probably we know there's a strong connection there.
Yes. And trying to also being obligated, but willfully obligated by Hamas and PIJ not to not to expose some of the things which are happening, shows that this is, this reporting is contrived. And foolishly, there are various news organizations that look to Al Jazeera as a news source from within Gaza.
Yeah.
Because they don't necessarily have correspondents on the ground in Gaza. So they look to Al Jazeera and they cite and source Al Jazeera foolishly.
Yeah.
And I would like to raise, why is Al Jazeera even on air in the United Kingdom?
Yeah.
Because Al Jazeera can be found on Sky channels, on Freeview, FreeSat, Virgin Media, here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And I don't like drawing comparisons between, Russia and Ukraine, because I think the conflict there is quite different to any equivalence on Israel-Gaza, right? So I'm not going to go into that. But what I will say is that very soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, RT Today was taken off air immediately.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not an advocate on restricting free speech, but I am an advocate on restricting terror-supporting, Hamas-supporting propaganda on British airwaves, which is what Al Jazeera is.
Yeah.
I agree. It is working for let's remember, an illegal organisation here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
I think that Al Jazeera should be removed from our air immediately, even if it is pending further investigation.
Yeah.
Because right now it is poisoning the narrative here in the UK.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's one of these things where in the journalistic world, journalists trust each other to be journalists and they protect each other, that kind of thing. And I think when Al Jazeera is targeted in this way, for example, I think when Israel outlawed Al Jazeera.
Oh, because Israel has outlawed Al Jazeera. Let's not forget that,
Yeah, and it's not the only country to do that, but it has outlawed Al Jazeera, and that was seen as an attack on the freedom of press. Well, like you said, the propaganda that Al Jazeera produces, I mean, people have to be aware, some of the videos they see on the BBC, on Sky News, on ITV are fake videos. There is, a word Pallywood, which is a play on the word Hollywood, where the Palestinians, you'll have 20 cameramen around someone running with a supposed body while screaming, and no one's helping that person. It's all for show because they're trying to just get this propaganda out there, and Al Jazeera is part of that. But I think what happens in the world's eyes, there are these institutions which are, sacred cows that need to be slain. And, we've been talking about them today. It's not just Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is one of those institutions which is highly corrupt, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, and it needs to be, dealt with in that manner. The same with UNRWA. UNRWA is, again, anti-Israel, linked with Hamas, being funded by the world and seen as this, angel of light kind of thing, when actually it is full of darkness.
Yes. The
same when it comes to pro-Palestinian protests on the streets of London, going back to Yahya Sinwar and the support for him. It's like they are, Hamas is itself being labelled as a freedom fighter and all the rest of it. And I think everything we've spoken about today just links with these sort of sacred cows that need to be slain, because the world is being hoodwinked by evil propaganda. And it is a spiritual battle we're in as much as it is a physical one. For us in the West, it is a spiritual battle.
100%.
And I think, if we have to be honest, we are losing this spiritual battle.
Yes.
Because the forces of evil are being allowed to run rampant and spread their lies, whilst truth and, the good news out there sort of thing is being suppressed and is being thwarted by evil, in my view.
Absolutely. No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. These organizations have been framed as being untouchable and not being able to, to criticize or anything like that. And I know the BBC now have a Verify on, where they scrutinize videos which are published on social media and try and, whilst most of the world has caught up with the fact that what they're seeing on social media is true, the BBC are trying to verify whether or not the actual rocket which they see exploding in the sky is real or not. Whilst, the rest of the world has caught up on the idea that, yes, Israel is actually under attack.
Yeah.
But Israel's doing that. And yet, when it is something which is being reported by Al Jazeera, they'll automatically say, oh, yes, it's verifiable because Al Jazeera has reported it.
Yeah, and a lot of Hamas's figures and things are because Al Jazeera has verified it.
They verified it. So that is problematic. But I think we should wrap up on what you have concluded there in joining these dots together, and the fact that, yes, we know that we're kind of going against the tide in many respects, because we know what the truth is, and we don't say that in some sort of like bragging way.
No,
we say it because actually we have a heart and a desire to know the truth. So we want to know what is the truth. We don't want to be lied to. And I think the problem with the anti-Semitic mindset is that they do not want to know the truth. They are willfully choosing to go against Israel. And so that's why they use terminology like genocide, because that's what they want to believe. Because they're anti-Semitic. And here at CUFI, we're doing what we can with the help of our supporters to counter these lies, and to speak the truth, and to end on a positive, if we can find a positive in all of this. It is, I think, encouraging that the reason we are sitting here today discussing these things is because there has been some exposure of the lie. UNRWA, we're talking about that because it has come to light. All of those suspicions that we have had for many years that there is corruption in UNRWA. Al Jazeera, which we have known for some time has been biased and anti-Israel, has been exposed as having much deeper connections with the Hamas terrorist organization. We are seeing expressions of support for a barbaric mass murderer, Yahya Sinwar, whose death has brought anti-Semites out of the woodwork. These things I believe we're going to see more of as we continue to pray for Israel, and to pray for that Israel will be victorious over its enemies, both in the physical sense and also in the spiritual sense, recognizing that there is a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. So don't be surprised if we continue to see more and more exposure of evil, because that is what it is. And we need to be ready with an answer with the truth. Because the truth is good. The truth is actually going to result in Israel being proclaimed over all the earth, and the glory of the God of Israel being exalted. So that's what we are doing. We're not just cowering defeatists that everything's falling apart. We are believing that there is going to be victory, and that Zion is going to be a proclamation of all the earth. So we need to hold tight. We watch, but we watch with great hope that actually we are on the side of victory. And the enemy, God's enemy and Israel's enemy, Satan, is going to be defeated.
Definitely.
So thank you for joining us in this cause of standing for Israel. We say, we quote the verse, "For Zion's sake we will not keep silent." And we really do mean that. That's why we do this podcast. That's why we do the various other things at Christians United for Israel, including our campaigns. And if you would like to support us in through making a donation towards the work of CUFI to make an impact for Israel in this nation, then we invite you to please make a donation by going to www.cufi.org.uk/donate. And there's an option there to become a partner with CUFI through a regular monthly donation or to give a one-off gift. All goes towards the work. All is greatly appreciated. We value your support. We value your prayers.
Yeah.
And we want to encourage you to not be silent, to not lose hope, to take courage and to take encouragement.
Yeah.
That by standing with Israel, we are standing on the side of truth.
Yeah.
And we just want to reiterate our love for Israel, our love for the Jewish people. We will not keep silent until Zion is made a praise of all the earth.
That's right, yeah. And I just want to add a scripture to the end. There's many scriptures about light and darkness. Isaiah 5 verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter," which is, I think, what's been happening. But, countering that, the scripture you mentioned, for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not hold my peace. And that ends up actually until her righteousness shines forth as brightness and her salvation as a lamp that burns. It's about Zion actually being a light to the world.
Yes.
I think that's a great way of looking at it. We are shining the light, proclaiming God's truth and countering the darkness.
That's right. Well, on that note, it's time to say goodbye. Alex is going to cancel his Al Jazeera subscription. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Bye-bye.